Well, hello, everybody. This is the last session on from Stream 2 on day 3 of the Digital Transformation in Government Conference. Today, we have Dr. Jeffrey Roy, professor in the School of Public Administration and the Faculty Management at Dalhousie University, where he specializes in democratic governance, business and government relations, and digital government reforms. In addition to teaching and research, he's consulted governments at all levels, sector, the UN, and the OECD. He's an associate editor at the International Journal of E-Government Research, a featured columnist in the Canadian Government Executive, the author of several books, including From Machinery to Mobility, Democracy and Government in the Participative Age, published by Springer in 2013. So his research has been supported by several funding bodies, including the Social Sciences and the Humanities Research Council of Canada and the IBM Center for the Business of Government. Professor Roy is also a member of the Transparency Advisory Group, for TAG, for Public Safety Canada. And today he'll be talking about COVID-19 and digitization and hybrid spaces, the implications and opportunities for public service organizations. Over to you, Doctor.
Thank you very much for that introduction. There is a little bit of choppiness in the audio, so hopefully I'm coming across clearly, and if not, please alert us so we can make some adjustments, but hopefully it's fine. Is that right? Okay, wonderful, thank you. Well, thank you for the introduction, and hello to everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I'm very excited about this session and this topic, and it seems like it's been a great conference thus far, and hopefully everybody's enjoying it. Just a heads up for those of you that are looking for a PowerPoint presentation to follow along, I decided not to use PowerPoint slides today. As a long-winded academic, I'm always a little afraid to use decks and sort of go on much too long in these sorts of sessions. And I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions and discussions because I've been doing variations of this presentations for a number of months now in different public sector venues. And it's always important for me to learn from your feedback and your questions as well. So happy to take a little bit more time to delve into your questions. I will also tell you in terms of resources that there's a report available online at my homepage at Dell underpinning this presentation, quite an extensive report, which I'll be speaking to essentially today. You're welcome to download that free of charge, excuse me. And there's also a radio podcast on CGE Radio, Canadian Government Executive Radio, which is about a 30-minute interview Q&A, which will again speak to some of the sessions or some of the themes that I'm speaking to in the session. So if you want to go back and have a reference to the session in some way, those are some resources that are available to you as well. And so with that, as you know, this presentation, or this talk, I should say, is on the COVID, the implications of COVID in terms of hybrid workspaces, with a particular focus in the public sector. And if you do want to sort of jot down a quick outline of what I'm going to be speaking to, basically, I'm just going to start with a little bit of a contextual introduction and use two quotes from two different people that I think kind of nicely frame some of the broader challenges and tensions that are out there with respect to thinking about hybrid, talk a little bit about two labor markets that we face, and then get into more of the specifics of my report and my research around what we see in terms of hybrid models in the public sector in Canada, to some extent elsewhere as well, but primarily my focus has been on the public sector in Canada. Talk a little bit about three principles in my report that I'll come back to and speak to in just a few minutes. So as you're well aware, I'm sure, as many people are living, since the start of COVID, there's sort of broad acceptance of potentially, at least I shouldn't say acceptance, but there's broad awareness of the growing importance of hybrid workspace arrangements that seek to find some sort of balance between in-person settings and virtual settings. And as you know, especially in the public sector, when COVID first hit, there was a significant impetus to working from home and to relying to a significant degree on remote working in a way that we've simply never seen before in this country. And what's interesting about that is I've myself been working in the digital government stream for about 2 decades now, since the advent of what was called e-government in the late 1990s. And really what COVID did was it sort of accelerated a key driver for rethinking notions of work and rethinking notions of workplace and workspaces. And just to give you a little bit of an anecdote on that, when I first started kind of working in the realm of digital government, e-government, I was at the University of Ottawa, which I believe is one of the hosts of this event, so it's great to be part of this. And I would occasionally go to meetings at Treasury Board, CIOB, in a downtown office at Bank and Laurier. And these were kind of very traditional government bureaucratic offices. I mean, the people that were working there were extremely bright and dedicated, but the offices, just felt very traditionally bureaucratic in terms of having, cubicles and dividers and beige walls and kind of depressing meeting rooms and that sort of thing. Flash forward to just recent years before COVID, and CIOB and the Open Government Unit and Canadian Digital Service, all these groups and significant parts of Treasury Board, are housed in a lovely new building just across the street from National Arts Center. And when I walked in that building for the first time a couple of years ago, I was really struck by the buzz of the building, the open collaboration, the workspaces in the lobby, the foyer, some of the innovation labs that kind of had a feeling like a Silicon Valley startup as opposed to government offices. Just remarkable transformation. And I actually left that day kind of feeling a little bit jealous of the fact that I would never get to work as a young public servant in that kind of environment. The question that we face today, of course, exiting as we hope we are away from COVID, even if we'll probably be living with COVID in some fashion for quite some time, is what to do about that kind of second example, what to do about some of the workspace innovations that have been developed in recent years, because there's a lot about that newer workspace, that newer building, that just simply does not jive very well with the new COVID realities that we face. Open collaboration, people walking in every direction, lots of interactions, that sort of thing. Whereas in recent months, we've been sort of thinking about safely bringing big people back to the workplace, and or allowing people flexibility to work remotely, depending on a variety of factors that we'll get into and talk about. So, the question is, do we need offices going forward? I think everybody agrees that we do need some degree of office space, of actual physical proximity, but thinking about things through the lens of hybrid, what does that balance look like between virtual and in person? And to start off with two quotes to kind of frame this a little bit more, everybody, of course, is familiar with Elon Musk, the founder and head of Tesla and SpaceX, and who knows how many other different initiatives, who recently ordained that all executives in Tesla should be back in the office in a very, very short period of time, and basically sort of lamented the idea of working from home, and basically argued that if people wanted to be taken seriously, they needed to be seen, and that essentially the more senior a person was in Tesla, the more important it was to be actually in a physical office. And so that's one view that's out there. I think everybody kind of agrees that that's a particularly extreme view. There's been lots of pushback in the business press about Musk's views on that and the risks to Tesla in taking such a view. And just to contrast that with another quote by a woman by the name of Anne Frank, who's the chief executive of the Chartered Management Institute in the UK. She was recently quoted in The Guardian as basically saying, and this is a direct quote now, "Command and control isn't the way we work now. The pandemic has knocked presenteeism on its head. Work should be output focused about what you do, not where you do it." And I have a particular bias in favor of that quote, because as I mentioned, working in the realm of digital government for quite some time, in 2013, I published a book entitled Machinery and Mobility, Tensions Between Traditional Governance Models in the Public Sector and New Emerging Digital Governance Models. And there was a chapter in that book on kind of new models of work, and basically thinking about work as output focused, as what people do, not essentially where people do it. Even in 2011, the BC government published a report called Workspace on digital government and on workforce development, which is still available online, where at the time in 2011, or perhaps 2012, I can't remember which one at the moment, but it was one or the other, over 50% of BC public servants in the survey basically said that it was not in their work office or in their cubicle where they felt most productive. And so already at that time, there was kind of a awareness of and search for more flexibility. And of course, COVID has been sort of going the other extreme, at least for short periods of time during particular waves. And now coming out of that, we're kind of left with this notion of what do we do? What does hybrid look like going forward? And so to be clear about this in terms of my own bias in this talk and in sort of reflecting on this challenge and in the work that I've done in recent months, I'm a big believer in the necessity of hybrid workspaces going forward. I absolutely do not embrace the notions of Musk, of presenteeism, and the fact that one needs to be seen. This is kind of what Sheryl Sandberg of Facebook called the busy bastard culture of large organizations, where you need to be seen to be credited for doing work. I believe that's very much kind of a dated view of the world, and value proposition of hybrid is really not only expanding the talent pool for governments and strengthening recruitment and retention for government, but also creating a more innovative and inclusive workspace. Now, that being said, despite that kind of underlying bias and viewpoint, it doesn't follow that there will be an embracement of hybrid on a large scale, because there are a lot of Elon Musks out there in the world, and there's kind of a traditional mindset of government that we need to be sort of aware of, that will push back on that. And really, the devil is in the details. It's how do we implement hybrid? What does hybrid look like? And I was just speaking yesterday with an associate deputy minister of a large federal department, who was telling me that just last week they had a town hall of employees with their deputy minister. And this person that I spoke to yesterday was shocked, and this was his own word that he used, shocked that every single question the deputy received from the town hall from employees focused on the future of what hybrid will look like for that organization. So I won't mention this particular organization because it was kind of a private conversation yesterday, but I will say that the high level commitments on the part of the federal government has been to commit to exploring and to pursuing hybrid work spaces and notions of hybrid going forward. But there's still a lot of trepidation and a lot of uncertainty in terms of what that will look like. And I'll try and flesh that out a little bit more in terms of my presentation now, or at least in terms of some of the key points that I made around sort of the two labor markets, different viewpoints that are out there, and then the three principles, which I'll come back and talk about, which I think sort of underpin questions around how to design hybrid going forward. I just wanted to mention very briefly in terms of two labor markets that I think that one of the challenges that we face, kind of going back to the two quotes that I just made, is that we obviously live right now in a very tight labor market with low unemployment, which has been kind of a driver for, in some respects, more flexibility in terms of work arrangements. Now, the question going forward is, if we do, enter more recessionary times as stock markets are correcting, as interest rates are rising, what does that mean for the labor market in terms of perhaps reframing notions of choice that people have? That's certainly an uncertainty and a risk that we need to be thinking about in terms of what the future environment will bring. And if unemployment were to grow and people were to sort of feel less flexible in terms of having fewer opportunities for fewer jobs, that might in turn change a little bit what I think right now, especially in the private sector, is a pretty strong impetus to be embracing hybrid as a tool for recruitment and retention. The danger, however, that I see for public sector is inadvertently creating a culture of mediocrity, where people largely stay in government because they feel comfortable having a job. They don't want to put that job at risk. But the best and the brightest, and this is particularly true in the realm of digital, where there's a lot of competition in the private sector, simply have more choices, more hybrid choices in the private sector than in the public sector. So broadly speaking, right now, we do see the private sector kind of ahead of the public sector in terms of offerings. But as I mentioned, many governments in Canada, including the province of Ontario, including some of the larger provinces like province of Ontario, but also the government of Canada, have committed to exploring and embracing hybrid to some degree, even if there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of what that looks like. Now, what do people think about hybrid? What do public servants think about hybrid? There are a lot of different viewpoints out there, but I think that the labor market in general, in terms of Canadian white-collared workers, which includes public servants, but also includes many service workers in the private sector, has been well summarized by a colleague at Carleton University, Linda Duxbury, who's done a lot of work in workplace management and human resource issues. She was recently quoted in CBC as having summarized all the labor market studies that have been done during COVID from a Canadian perspective, as well as her own research. And she synthesized that down to the following kind of breakdown. In her view, and this is Duxbury now, 25% of people, of office workers would like to go back to the office full time, full stop. There are a lot of reasons for that. It could be their home demands, it could be the missing of interaction with colleagues, it could be just what they're used to, but that's where they want to be. 25% would never go back if given the choice. They're very comfortable working from home. They want to continue to do their job working from home. They don't see the need to go home. As an example of that would be Southwest Airlines in the US, which just announced that they're permanently shutting their customer service call centers, and all customer service agents for Southwest will permanently work remotely. Other technology companies have embraced permanent remote work on a permanent basis as well. Many other industries, notably the banks, have committed to various hybrid solutions that are kind of working through that right now. So to finish off, 50% of people are looking for some kind of balance, some sort of compromise or some sort of balance between being part of the work week at home or perhaps remotely in different locations. This could be satellite offices, or it could be cottages, or it could be different locations due to travel, and part of the work week in the office. So 25, 25, 50. And I think the important takeaway there is that 75% of service workers, of office workers, basically are seeking some degree of hybrid arrangement, which I think is kind of an overwhelming endorsement and message to organizations that organizations need to be thinking very clearly about in terms of what sort of workplace and workspace. Workspace, of course, including virtual elements, are going to be embraced in the future. So as I mentioned, my own bias is that I think hybrid is both a necessity to respond to those sorts of numbers, which also kind of reflects my own interviews with public servants, my own interactions with mid-career public servants in our mid-career Dalhousie MPAM program. Not to promote that program, but have a look at it if you're interested. And I also think there's an opportunity. There's an opportunity to kind of leverage digital innovation and to really kind of embrace the notion that different people have different work styles based on different jobs, different personalities, different home life commitments, that basically underscore the Anne Frank quote that I read at the beginning, this notion of empowering people to decide for themselves where best to work, even if that empowerment, can't be complete without considerations of what collective organizations require in terms of team interactions. And this was the message that the Deputy Minister was trying to convey to his employees in the town hall that I mentioned last week, that there needed to be some kind of trade-off and some kind of balance, and that they were trying to work through that. So with that as broad context, the report that I wrote that's available online basically, fleshes out from the analysis and reporting that's been done and the research that's been done on hybrid, 3 key design principles that I think are important for the public sector to be thinking about essentially going forward. And those principles, and I'll just mention them now and I'll talk about each of them, but I'll emphasize a little bit more the third one in terms of what I want to focus on today. The first is differentiation, the second is engagement, and the third is inclusion. So basically differentiation is pretty intuitive and straightforward. The notion here is not only that individuals have differentiated viewpoints on what they want and what they need going forward, but that organizations should be allowed to experiment and to come up with their own solutions. And so if you look at the reporting that's been done on the federal government, CBC published an article several weeks ago where they kind of did a canvas of all major federal units and found quite a lot of variation in terms of how departments and agencies were approaching the notion of hybrid. Provinces, likewise, have taken many different approaches in terms of embracing degrees of hybrid. Some of that can be political, in terms of different political parties having different ideological approaches to the importance of hybrid versus the importance of trying to seek public servants back in the office as a signal of normality in terms of lessening COVID. But broadly speaking, I do think that what's important is to sort of avoid this notion of command and control, top-down recipes and solutions that will work for all units of government, whether you're talking about the federal or the province or local government, or of course, for the public sector as a whole. I'm really strongly a believer in this notion of bottom-up experimentation, bottom-up design. And I'll talk a little bit about a resource at the end that I think kind of underscores and underpins that presentation as well. And I do feel like there's been some encouraging flexibility thus far in terms of allowing departments and agencies essentially to have a degree of flexibility to kind of pursue their own path in terms of designing what hybrid looks like. The second principle is a little more problematic in terms of what I've seen and what I've heard from my consultations and certainly our mid-career public servants, and that's the notion of employee engagement, which on the whole, I think is more lacking in the public sector than has been the case in some private sector examples. And certainly there's a feeling from public servants that I've spoken to, particularly mid-career managers, that there's an absence of engagement and input in terms of what the future will bring. So I realize there's a little bit of a contradiction there in terms of the first two, in the sense that on the one hand, there's been some flexibility from above, whether it's been ministers and deputy ministers affording senior managers some degree of flexibility to implement hybrid in ways that vary. But on the other hand, if you go within the organization and you talk to mid-career managers or frontline employees, where hybrid might be an option, particularly in office environments, there's a feeling that those conversations have been limited. There are often deputy town halls, as referring to the one I referred to, where deputies kind of give their viewpoints and their sense of where things are going. There's of course a little bit of Q&A. But what I think is really important, and what I think the research underscores in terms of designing hybrid going forward, is that it does really need to be a participative process involving employees at all levels. And the people that I think are struggling most in large organizational settings, and certainly in government settings, are mid-career managers that have to balance the demands from above in terms of senior management, where the research suggests there's a little bit more of kind of an inclination to want to get back to the office, because that's been the traditional mindset of how people have worked, particularly at senior levels, versus, and also those mid-career managers having to kind of navigate their teams. And there's been a significant increase in mental health challenges in terms of people facing challenges and isolation considerations working from home. The president of Shopify has spoken and written quite eloquently about being an extroverted leader, essentially struggling with mental health, being isolated at home for long periods of time. Notwithstanding that, Shopify has declared the era of office centricity to be over and is embracing hybrid and flexible work models on a large scale. So the bottom line is, in a perfect world, we would need an algorithm that would design a workspace based on people's personalities, people's job requirements, people's home life balance, and their team responsibilities in terms of interaction. In the absence of that algorithm, which of course doesn't exist, we need to have conversations. And some of the reports that I mentioned in an appendix in my report, particularly a fairly high-level study that was done in the UK, really emphasizes the importance of employee engagement, the importance of conversations, and certainly the models of hybrid that I've seen that have been most successful thus far are models where managers have allowed employees to shape those, to be involved in the decision-making process that ultimately shapes what that hybrid model looks like, and to also kind of be in a constant process of iteration, to understand that this is a new environment that we're in, that there's going to be experimentation, there will be failures, there will be successes, and we have to learn from that. So that's differentiation, engagement, and inclusion. The third principle, inclusion, I think is the most complex and in some ways the most controversial one in terms of whether it will come from hybrid or not. And this, I think, to me is one of the most fascinating opportunities that we have to rethink notions of workspace diversity and inclusion. But it doesn't mean that it's going to happen automatically, because of course questions abound about how ultimately hybrid is rolled out and what that means for inclusion. So basically, I would suggest, and I suggest in my report, that there are at least 3 different ways in which hybrid can improve, can widen and deepen inclusion in workspaces. And I draw from a lot of different research sources in making these claims. First, certainly by expanding the geographic scope of recruitment. So allowing organizations to recruit from a wider geographic plane if some of those jobs can be virtual. And anecdotally, I've heard some examples of government job postings that have been going up in the past several months that are partially or fully virtual, which is obviously a big change from past practices. Mark Zuckerberg, the president and founder and CEO and everything else of Meta, formerly Facebook, has spoken publicly about how that company is embracing flexible work models because they view it as a way of expanding their talent pool, which he himself admitted was not the case prior to COVID, where he was much more of a champion of encouraging people to be in the workplace at Facebook headquarters, where now they're very much rethinking that. And if the private sector is doing that, that of course increases competitive pressure on government, but also creates opportunities for government to do that as well. So you increase the geographic scope of recruitment. Secondly, you create more flexible and diverse career progressions for people, particularly marginalized communities and minorities that have been traditionally marginalized in the workplace setting. And here there's a very complicated relationship between the notion of in-person presenteeism and how that has basically reinforced a culture of white Caucasian males, to be quite frank. And if you look at the data coming out of the public sector in Canada, although there's been significant process on gender balance in terms of the public sector, particularly at the federal level, racialized communities, minorities, are still very, very much in minority at senior levels of executive positions in the government. And I talk about some of the data on that in my report. There's a CBC article last year that was very blunt in its headline that said 80% of elected officials and senior managers in Vancouver local governments are white, which of course is a pretty stark portrayal and not at all reflection of the Vancouver community. So there's a lot of work to do in terms of improving inclusion, and hybrid can be an important tool in doing that. And thirdly, it creates new opportunities for building trust, for building community in ways that are at least partially virtual. So we're kind of past this notion of the fact that conversations and meetings can only happen in person. I think everybody agrees there's still value in in-person interactions, and that's still important in many ways. But there's been lots of anecdotal reporting and case studies in the media and in research about how organizations have used Zoom and Teams and other sorts of virtual settings to try and build inclusion and build diversity and build community in ways that are now at least partially virtual. So I think there are two broad research questions for those that are interested in kind of more some of the research directions around inclusion that that come out of some of these potential hypotheses that are out there. And the first research question is, to what degree are workforce inequalities intertwined with physical proximity and presenteeism? And this is an interesting question to bring back to Tesla, because Tesla's been under a lot of pressure for their lack of diversity, and they've recently been delisted from an important DEI index in terms of their some of the challenges they've had in terms of racism in the workplace and things of that sort. But the reality is there's been kind of a limited pool of individuals that have been able to climb to the most senior echelons of organizations. And so rethinking that relationship and between proximity and inclusion is extremely important. And then secondly, does the emergence of hybrid models widen or narrow inclusion? Does it increase forms of opportunities for people to be part of decision-making processes? And of course, a lot depends on how hybrid is implemented. So in my report, I quote from two researchers in the US, published a report in Hybrid Business Review. They suggest that what's really important is for organizations to really start thinking about collecting data in these areas as hybrid and more flexible work models are rolled out. And they talk about 4 key areas of data collection. I'll just mention these quickly, but again, they're in my report. Who's spending time in the office and who's spending time at home? So kind of tracking that and understanding those patterns. Who gets to choose when to be in the office and when to be at home versus essentially being forced to? How does office time in the office shape paths to promotion? And the countervailing question there is, are there disadvantages? Are there barriers that come about if people are not in the office as much as other people? and how are remote management tactics used in the workplace? So these are just some of the questions that I think we need to study more, and we need to better understand the broader relationship between inclusion and the notion of hybrid and what hybrid can mean for creating a more inclusive workspace. The potential is there, but the result is not necessarily a given one. And so just to wrap up and to conclude, where I think we're going and what I think the research on hybrid shows is that we need to be thinking about workforce development through a more holistic and integrative lens that really brings together three key streams that have traditionally in the public sector been rather siloed. The first is digital government, basically, and you know there are two aspects of digital in terms of thinking about that notion: infrastructure and also innovation. And so kind of championing digital innovation reforms and thinking about infrastructure needs both in the office and also what that means in terms of remote settings. That would be the first stream. The second stream would be human resource systems, which again have not necessarily always been viewed through the digital lens. That's been changing to some degree in recent years, but I think there needs to be much closer integration between those two themes. And I'll just mention in passing that late last year, there was a kind of a joint commitment on the part of the Chief Human Resources Officer and the part of the federal government and the CIO and the head of Shared Services Canada to kind of pursue the hybrid workplace models in an integrated way, which I think is a positive step in that regard. And then finally, diversity, DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that sometimes is a sub-theme of human resources, and sometimes it's kind of separate when you're talking about gender-based management and that sort of thing. But really, what hybrid does is it kind of brings together those three key critical streams of managing people and how people interact, and necessitates kind of a more integrated viewpoint around thinking about workplace development and workspace development. So with that, I'm going to stop there, and hopefully that gives you a little bit of sense of sort of where I'm coming out on this topic, and I'd be happy to take any questions and hear any thoughts that you might have around this topic as well. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much. At this time, we don't have any questions. So just a reminder to everybody, if you want to click on the Q&A button in the upper right, that'll allow you to submit your questions. A lot of information there. I guess being a public servant myself, I'm pretty sure that you described as having happened at the town hall recently. It's probably happening at very many town halls across the board at many other departments as well. So what is it? What can we start to think about in terms of like any sort of or has this factored into any of your analysis in terms of the economic impacts to that in terms of hybrid, say within the public service? So if we choose all of a sudden to scale back significantly the public buildings that we hold and manage for offices and I guess the feeder businesses that are associated with that in the locale. I wonder if that's something you can speak to.
Yeah, it's a great point, and I do mention in my report that it's not an area that I deal with directly in my report, but I do mention it as an area that necessitates additional kind of research and thinking in terms of what we have traditionally thought about as smart cities and smart communities, which up until COVID has largely kind of embraced physical proximity and the power of urban interactions within cities. Now I think for two reasons, COVID of course being one of them, and the acceleration of digital, but also climate change of course is a consideration. And it's important to point out that even prior to COVID, the government of Canada had embraced remote working as one part of their climate change strategy that they would try and enhance going forward and expand. President Obama was also a big fan when he was president of remote work for the same reason. He kind of viewed it as part of the climate change challenge, not only for the country as a whole, but specifically for Washington, D.C. in terms of congestion and things of that sort. Now, the pushback to that is that we've had premiers who have understandably been anxious to signal a return to normalcy and Also, there's strong pressure from downtown business communities to bring public servants back to offices, which of course is understandable. So I think, there are some pushes and some pulls here going forward. But when you look at the research coming out of Toronto, for example, and even the financial services industry in downtown Toronto around King and Bay, there's not an expectation that foot traffic in the in-person activity will come back to pre-COVID levels anytime soon. And that's in part because more and more organizations are embracing hybrid, at least on a partial degree. So I think that creates opportunities and challenges. I don't think cities are going to hollow out and that'll be kind of the end of downtown. I think already we're seeing kind of a resurgence of some downtown communities in many cities. But one of for reasons to do with both climate change and to do with COVID and the acceleration of digital, certainly it's important to kind of have those conversations at the local level involving cities in terms of what the future of urban planning might, how that might change going forward. And also, of course, if you're talking about the National Capital Region and the huge real estate footprint of the federal government, what that might mean to planning going forward. So I think in general, though, it's a lessening of real estate concentration in large cities that we see in both the private and the public sectors. And I think in general, that creates, some degree of freedom, some element of opportunity through both the climate change lens and through digital innovation lens. But understanding some of the pushback against that is important. And, also the fact that there will still, as we talked about through the presentation and going back to the Treasury Board examples, there's still a very important need for people to gather together. And that's likely to occur more often than not in cities as opposed to other venues. And then finally, I would just say that, as outside the scope of my research and my report, but certainly there's been some interest and some hope that that the digital aspect, that both of these aspects, really, COVID and climate change, will kind of lead to some elements of rural empowerment as well. So in Nova Scotia, for example, we've seen, a real uptake of real estate in rural regions in Nova Scotia, because at least a small portion of office workers from Toronto, to a lesser degree from Halifax, from Montreal, feel that they can work remotely and therefore have a cottage location or have a rural location to do that. And so I think that there's at least some hope, which I'm not sure has been translated into evidence yet, but there's some anecdotal evidence of that in terms of rural real estate markets, that some of the outsourcing of urban activity can also be to the benefit of rural communities as well, which I think is a positive thing as well.
As long as you can have a good bandwidth connection, I guess it doesn't really matter anymore, right?
So long as the infrastructure is there, that's certainly the case. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so we have a question here. Have you observed any significant generational differences in perspectives on work? It follows, do you think that a lack of a hybrid workspace would make it hard to obtain or retain Gen Z talent?
Oh, I think it's a great question. And I think there are huge generational differences in terms of how people have grown up and how people interact with technology. I was just speaking to a deputy minister the other day, and I was telling him that, excuse me, that I had spoken last week to one of our full-time on-campus 20-something MPA students, and she was working for this department. So she's a full-time student in Halifax, but for the summer, she returned to her parents' home in Brampton, Ontario, to work for a federal department out of Ottawa. And she offered to go to Ottawa, but they said, well, listen, we're still transiting back from COVID. Most of your work is going to be virtual. If you want to live in Brampton and save on rent and everything, that's fine. And she's having a great experience. She could not feel more engaged and involved in meetings in terms of what she's learning. Now, people my age, and this deputy that I was referring to, would think that clearly what is being lost is kind of the onboarding of new workers and the informal experience and the mentoring and things of that sort that you can only get if you're in the office. And I absolutely do not deny that's important. I mean, I remember my own experiences as a government intern and an intern working for a Canadian bank, how much I learned informally by being in that environment, both in terms of what I enjoy and what I don't enjoy. That's partly why I'm not working in banking today, because I had the experience of being inside a bank for a period of time. Nothing, of course, against banks at all. They're very important organizations and very digitally adept as well. So I think it does depend, and I don't mean to suggest that young people today don't need that in-person experience. We hear a lot, but one of the things that's been very encouraging through COVID is that through our internship programs of people doing the MPA at younger ages, has been the very positive degree of involvement and inclusion that they've had in virtual. That being said, there's a hunger in many cases to be able to return to the office, at least part of the time, to have that human interaction. It does vary in terms of federal, provincial, and organization. But one of the key underpinnings of why hybrid is so essential is that younger people just have a much more seamless relationship with technology, and so that they've kind of been living a hybrid life really all through university and in many cases through the early years in the work setting, and often it's been quite stymieing and constraining for them to be in a cubicle from 9 to 5, expected to work in that kind of environment, which is not the case for everyone, but is still the case for most young people. So we need to find a balance, and we need to find a balance. And I think one of the encouraging aspects of COVID is that it's allowed more people of my generation to become more comfortable with virtual means. We're now living in Zoom, we're doing Teams, we're perhaps spending too much time in front of our devices, but it does enable us to go forward and find that balance, and hopefully will allow people to feel included and involved virtually and in person in ways that also are sensitive to demographic differences, which I think is a really important point to be thinking about. So it's a great question. Thank you.
I suppose another aspect to that might be that the fact that our generation had to also live through the introduction of some of that infrastructure, which was not always done well, or that it was just in its infancy. So I guess the newer generation are coming in at a time where a lot of the kinks have been worked out, I guess, and so the experience is that much better. I've got another question for you. Have you observed any worries about security aspects related to sensitive employer data transmissions from employees' homes to their employer data repositories?
Thank you. Another great question. As was mentioned in my bio, I'm a very peripheral member of the public safety, national security community, by virtue of an advisory board on transparency. So I'm a little bit plugged into this conversation through the lens of Public Safety Canada. And they clearly have some degree of high security infrastructure in terms of classified files and information that can only be processed in person right now. So that that kind of necessitates right there a certain level of in-person proximity, particularly at senior levels of the organization. But the flip side is they've been very proactive and aggressive in trying to embrace hybrid flexibility for as many workers as possible, and also try to facilitate that flexibility for as many areas of the organization as possible going forward as well. The other angle, of course, for Public Safety Canada is that they have the Canadian Cybersecurity Center, so they're very aware of the risks of cybersecurity that stem from more and more people using mobile devices, being on insecure Wi-Fi networks, that sort of thing. So this again is part of the importance of the conversation of kind of bridging the digital community, CIOs that have been thinking about security questions for a long time, and of course, remote work and laptops and mobile devices. This is not new because of COVID. It's obviously accelerated in terms of working from home, and there are a lot of important lessons that we can draw from the work from home experience, where every organization has breaches, every organization has issues, but generally speaking, the public sector, as well as other sectors like retail and the financial services, have held up pretty well, through the COVID, and through relying greatly on people working through remote devices and remote networks. So it's not impossible. It needs to be dealt with in a thoughtful manner. CIOs, of course, are very much aware of that. But it's why, again, we need to bring together these kind of traditionally siloed camps of digital management, human resource management, thinking about people systems, and also diversity, equity, inclusion in terms of that element as well. But without question, security needs to be a top of mind issue in terms of designing hybrid flows and hybrid strategies going forward.
It's a good point. We had yesterday someone from FinTrack talking about how, due to the nature of the data, and many of their systems are closed networks, so they had to have people coming in person. We don't have any more questions this time. So I think we can close it there. I'd just like to thank you very much for your presentation and for the discussion and for sharing with us the work that you've been doing. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye now. Thanks.
Okay, take care. Bye. For everyone else, I'd just like to say thanks to everyone. It's the last presentation for Stream 3. We'll have a closeout session, I believe, today. We've got the conference wrap-up, which we can switch over to at 4:15. I just want to thank everyone for those of you that were on Stream 2 today, and for those of you who've been attending for the last 2 days. Thanks very much. Bye.